change the treaty title and preamble to the treaty to make it clear what it does and what it doesn't do. We ought to have as a minimum standard a limitation on benefits rule and a principal purposes test, or a principal purposes test, or a limitation on benefits rule and an anti-conduit rule. Now, don't worry too much about what each of them mean. This is trying to say that as a minimum you have to have an anti-abuse rule in treaties. The US will say, I don't like principal purposes. So it might say, well, I'll have a limitation on benefits and an anti-conduit financing rule, anti-conduit rule, which is what most of its treaties already have. So the US will say, tick the box, I've already satisfied this minimum standard. But very few countries will want to have a limitation on benefits clause and a principal purposes test, but that was where BEPS wanted it to go. They wanted to have the bright line test and the subjective test. Because a lot of countries quite like the principal purposes test because it's an easier one to understand, it's thought that that could be on a standalone basis. And then there was lots of other changes that were made at the same time. So there's two changes that are important. One is a change to the treaty title and preamble, and secondly, a requirement that going forward, as a minimum standard from the OECD, all treaties ought to have a principal purposes test or a limitation on benefits test. Treaty abuse at its real simplest is, say we're in this situation here, and there's dividends, interest, royalties, or something of that type paid between B and A, and there's no treaty, then domestic withholding tax will apply and won't be reduced under the treaty. But if we insert NUCO, and there is a treaty between B and the country of residence of NUCO, then we can benefit from a reduced withholding tax. The treaty abuse provisions are trying to cope with far more widespread and wide-ranging tax planning than that, but that's the sort of thing it's aimed at too. So that's very simple. What was changed? Well, in the OECD 2017 model, the title was changed. It's the same as the UN model, I should say, to provide that the convention is for the elimination of double taxation on income and capital, and the prevention of tax evasion and avoidance. Okay? So that is how the recommendation is that the treaty title is changed. And it is quite worrying to a lot of people that tax evasion and tax avoidance is used in the same sentence. Because we've always said tax evasion is illegal and tax avoidance is not illegal. So it's very strange that they're used together without any explanation of what is meant by avoidance. So how different countries are going to interpret this going forward is a big question mark. And then the title has changed. The preamble changes too, to try and give some sort of understanding about what's meant there. And that talks about, without creating opportunities for non-taxation or reduced taxation through tax evasion or avoidance, including through treaty shopping arrangements aimed at providing reliefs provided in this convention for the indirect benefit of residents of third states. So, providing relief for indirect residents, A, of treaty relief. Okay, so that helps a little bit in the sense that one of the things it's focusing on is to say, without creating opportunities for non-taxation. Because actually it's very interesting, where there's the possibility of getting double taxation between two countries, there's also the possibility of getting non-taxation because something falls out of account between the two countries concerned. So that very much was the focus of this, but it does again in that preamble talk about tax evasion or avoidance, and very specifically talk about treaty shopping arrangements. So inserting NewCo between two companies simply to benefit from the model treaty, or the treaties that are in place, would be caught by this, I think, now. And it's also very important, we'll come on to briefly to interpretation later. All treaties have to be interpreted in the light of their context, in the light of what they're supposed to do. It's just a general rule of interpretation. Well, we look to the title of the treaty and we look to the preamble to tell us what they're meant to do. So this, I think, is a very, very significant change in terms of the way that treaties will be interpreted going forward. What's a principal purposes test? Well, again, just looking at, I've looked here at the Multilateral Convention, which is bringing in this minimum standard, and it says that the obtaining of the benefit was one of the principal purposes of an arrangement or transaction that resulted directly or indirectly in that benefit, unless it is established that granting the benefit in these circumstances would be in accordance with the object and purpose of the relevant provision of the treaty. In the multilateral treaty they refer to covered tax agreements, but that's just a cross-reference from the multilateral convention to the individual treaties. Okay, so it's you can see that this particular test is quite an easy one. It doesn't take much to explain. Yes, please. But it's interpreting it that's difficult. So it doesn't take very many words. It's a question of reasonableness. You look at a transaction, you look at what a taxpayer has undertaken. What was their purpose? What do you think it was? It may have to go before a court to make a decision as to how reasonable the transaction was. But it's an easy anti-abuse rule to write, and in practice, most of the time, you look at a structure or you look at an arrangement that a taxpayer has, and you'll say, it's fine. It doesn't fall foul of this. The main reason for doing it, because you have to do it for commercial reasons. And if commercial reasons is the overriding driver for the transaction or the way you've done something, it's fine. But there are a lot of things that will probably be in the way. Thank you very much. So in some cases, did any of you manage to get to Richard Walter's presentation? Was it on Friday last week? He was doing something on tax avoidance. Did anybody get to that? Yeah. I suspect he talked about the UK sole or main benefit test. And one of the main purposes of undertaking the transaction is, it's very similar to that test. And there's a lot of case law in the UK that tried to determine what it meant. So we're looking at that sort of thing being replicated.